Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Var Valley podcast. The word var is short for the French word varier, which means a person who varies. This channel is a spin-off of the History Valley podcast, which is where I spend much of my time interviewing mainstream scholars. Over here, however, I and the co-host of this channel, DJ Shonsky, interview a variety of alternative scholars who have radically different views from the mainstream. That being said, I'll provide the following disclaimer. I am not convinced by any of the people that are being interviewed here on Var Valley, and my views may not align with the views of DJ Shonsky. I am simply curious to figure out why they believe the things that they believe, and it does not represent my views in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
We today have a special guest, Emmet Sweeney, who has been on our show before. Emmet authored a book. This book here we discussed, The Genesis of Israel and Egypt in the Ages of Alignment series. And today we are going to have a discussion about Professor Gunnar Heinsohn, who also was on the show twice. He did a presentation on AD chronology revision and BCE chronology revision. We are going to re-air the BCE chronology revision video shortly. But I'd like to first of all talk a little bit about Gunnar Heinsohn's research. He has 750 publications. His paper, The Disastrous 10th Century Cataclysmic Collapse, has 15,700 downloads and views. His work dealt with the history and theory of civilization, which includes population, childhood, and family, economy, religion, genocide and war, and chronology. Professor Heinsohn passed away on February 16th of this year. So I thought it only fitting for Emmet Sweeney to talk a little bit about the BCE chronology. And today we're going to actually discuss, is the BCE chronology based on biblical fundamentalist dates? Gunnar Heinsohn was on the show, and Gunnar Heinsohn gave a pretty good presentation dealing with that. So without further ado, I'd like to reintroduce Emmet Sweeney back to the show. Emmet, thank you for coming on, and happy belated St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you very much, Sean, and good day. It's good to be here.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Gunnar's work. We're both familiar with it. There's some people on the channel familiar. Some people aren't familiar. Let's talk a little bit about Gunnar Heinsohn's work with chronology and a little bit of the history of the chronology revision. And we'll kind of have to go back to Velikovsky for a brief moment. Could you talk about that for a few minutes?
Yes. Velikovsky was the first to recognize that there was something actually seriously wrong with the early Egyptian chronology. I don't want to go into depth or any great depth about how he came to that realization. Essentially, the idea that, the greatest event in Hebrew history, the Exodus, was apparently unmentioned in Egyptian hieroglyphic documentation. Made him think, could there be something wrong here with the chronology? And he came to discover Egyptian documents, which apparently did refer to events very, very similar to the Exodus, especially the Ipuwer papyrus and the prophecy of Neferti. The problem is that these documents were dated 700 or 800 years before the biblical date of the Exodus. And from that starting point, it came to the realization that there was something seriously wrong, that Egyptian and Hebrew histories weren't tied together properly. They weren't synchronized properly. There was something wrong, something seriously wrong. He wrote a series of books intended to kind of rectify the problem. Velikovsky realized that Egyptian history was placed centuries, the Egyptian kings and dynasties rather were placed centuries too early and brought down several centuries. They kind of formed a fit, a very satisfactory fit, and we might have time to discuss some of the things that Velikovsky discovered by his chronological revision. But to cut a long story short, he never got to the bottom of the issue. And it was Gunnar Heinsohn that really, I think, put the finishing touches to the whole picture, if you like, of BC chronology. He realized that Velikovsky believed, for example, first of all, I have to state that Velikovsky believed that the problem with synchronizing Egypt and Israel, these two close neighbors, by the way, which should have a lot of their histories should display a lot of correspondences, apparently display none. So he thought it was Egyptian chronology that was to blame. But Gunnar Hansen around it was 1988 or 1989, realized that it was actually the Bible. It was biblical chronology and the attempt to apply biblical chronology to Egypt that was at the root of the problem. And it went back a long, long way. It went back actually to Alexandria, the 2nd or 3rd century BC. And from that starting point, what Gunnar Hansen did was stated that the whole of ancient history, the chronology of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the lands of Anatolia, the Hittites, all these histories need to be scrapped because they're actually works of fiction as they stand, and we need to begin, this is the task of chronological revision from the beginning. We need to rebuild the whole of ancient history, and basically everything needs to be rewritten.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental problem, Gunnar Hansen said, and he was correct as far as I'm concerned, there was an attempt by early Jewish authors in Alexandria, essentially the authors of the Septuagint, followed by early Christian authors, to justify the Bible by finding correspondences with Egypt. Now, that was a good idea. I mean, these are two close neighbors. They're next neighbors.
Right.
As many are actually the greatest events of biblical history concern Egypt directly, especially the Exodus, but many others. And the idea that if we can find Egyptian references to these events, it would have been a great tool to elucidate the histories of both Egypt and the Bible. But the problem is, if you're going to make a link between the two histories, you have to make a correct link. And what Gunnar Hansen found, and this was a problem discovered actually, or noted almost a century ago by the great Edward Meyer, I think it was, but not fully. It was identified, but not taken on board. The problem not taken on board. Edward Meyer realized that the authors of the Septuagint, working in Alexandria, had identified Adam, the first man of the Bible, with Menes or Men, the first pharaoh. And they made the whole of Egyptian history, as found in Manetho's, which is now lost history, but it wasn't lost then. But they made the whole of Egyptian history fallen behind that starting point. They dated Adam to what we would say about 4,500 BC. And that was therefore where they placed Min or Menes. Now, the thing is that Egyptian history more or less begins at the same place right now, and thereby betraying the ultimately biblical origin of that chronology. But almost nobody is aware of that anymore, because a whole host of allegedly scientific justifications for that date were then introduced in the 19th and early 20th century. But these failed to make any present any fundamental challenge to the biblical date, which was already found in textbooks in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And there are many ways we can illustrate that. Velikovsky himself, for example, pointed to a Scottish doctor, a Dr. John Pritchard, writing in about 1801. And he said that the third Ramesses III of Manetho's list, reigned 1190 BC. Now that's very close to the date still found for Ramesses III. But Dr. Pritchard's date was derived entirely from the working of Manetho's list according to biblical timescales. And Dr. Pritchard wrote that 20 years before Champollion had read the first line of an Egyptian text. So before the foundation of Egyptology as a proper discipline, we already had an Egyptian chronology, and nothing has been able to uproot it. And that Egyptian chronology is based on a fundamentalist interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. As I say, most people, or almost nobody nowadays, knows this, even professional Egyptologists. They genuinely believe that their chronology, which they quote, with great confidence, and they will argue maybe over 1 or 2 years regarding, the accession date of Thutmose III or somebody like that. And they're not willing to concede any more than 1 or 2 years in terms of moving things about. So they think that their chronology, that their history has some scientific basis, and it hasn't. And that's a big problem.
I would like to also show what I do with it. Here it is. If I can get it on camera. This book here, I'm going to try to move it as close as I can. This is Pillars of the Past by Charles Janenthal, Egypt and Palestine. This book is an excellent source book for these arguments. And I'm going to show some slides here in a bit from Gunnar Heinsohn, what I gained from that book. And it takes some time because they're packed with information. That at the time of the excavations themselves in Egypt and Palestine, there was controversy in the 1800s with the excavations.
Yep.
To whereas even Flinders Petrie and some of the prominent Egyptologists at the time were in a conundrum. And one example is, and I'm going to say was 6th or 7th century BCE excavation in Palestine. I don't remember the exact location when they went into the archaeological dig. They found scarabs and pottery. Specifically, I think it was the some of the vases and handles that the people in Palestine at that time were paying their taxes to Amenhotep and Thutmose. So immediately, the excavators were in a conundrum. There were arguments at the time. So these artifacts were written off as forgeries, duplicates of rendering backwards, we'll say 1,000 years or so. Can you talk a little bit about that conundrum specifically? I don't remember the exact site that they actually were excavating. I have to look back and double check. But could you talk about this conundrum?
Yeah, Sean, it was actually in several places in Palestine that McAllister, the British archaeologist, and his team discovered these scarabs of 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs in strata, which belonged to the 7th, 6th, 7th, and 8th century BC. So really 500, 600, 700 years after, you would expect to find scarabs of Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Ramesses II. But they were coming across these scarabs repeatedly in strata which they otherwise, from the pottery, etc., and the discovery of, alphabetic Hebrew and Phoenician script, they knew belonged to the 6th and 7th century BC. So there was a huge argument and debate about how to interpret these scarabs. And eventually it was decided that on this occasion, McAllister decided that these were in fact duplicates, fake antiques, if you like, created during the 6th or 7th century BC. And that has been the pattern in every single site throughout the Middle East over the past 200 years of excavation. Again and again and again, anomalies were discovered and continue to be discovered. Without exception, every single excavation raises these issues. But now the two expedients for explaining these anomalies away. Number one, as we said, forgeries, and number two was heirlooms. Okay, I'll give you another example. In the Hittite or the Neo-Hittite city of Carchemish in northern Syria, excavators found in Neo-Hittite layers artifacts clearly belonging to the Hittite Empire, supposedly 500 years earlier. Leonard Woolley was involved in this, the great Leonard Woolley, the excavator of Ur in Mesopotamia. And again, there was a long debate how to interpret these Hittite Empire artifacts in strata, which were clearly Neo-Hittite and belonging to 600 or 700 years later. And again, these were now, rather than both forgeries and heirlooms were used as an explanation. This was found throughout Greece, throughout Cyprus. In Komi, for example, a great A.S. Murray, another British archaeologist, at a great cemetery in Cyprus called Enkomi, they discovered a huge cemetery where people of high rank, royalty or aristocracy were interred with very precious artifacts. From the pottery in the Enkomi tombs, it was clear that these belonged to the 6th or 7th century BC. However, they were found interred with artifacts of the late 18th dynasty, from the reign of scarabs, etc., from the time of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. And in fact, what was very peculiar about the Enkomi burials, and it was a major controversy. It was clear that the cemetery was only used for about 50 years. So again, there was this incredible problem. How were people of the 6th or 7th century BC buried with artifacts, Egyptian artifacts, and Mycenaean Greek artifacts, supposedly 700 years earlier or older? And again, on this occasion, it was decreed that these things were heirlooms, which were handed down for 600 or 700 years in these aristocratic royal families, and then buried. But again, I mean, basically every single site that has been excavated and is excavated throughout the Middle East and the Near East produces these problems, and it's still the same to this day. But now the archaeologists have got into the swing of explaining them away. It's done almost like a reflex action now. So they find they're excavating something from the time of the late Hebrew kings, okay, and they come across an Egyptian scarab or artifact of the 19th dynasty. Oh, that's an heirloom. They don't even, it's barely noted. It's put in a footnote just now. We found a couple of artifacts or scarabs of the 19th dynasty. Clearly, these were heirlooms handed down for many centuries, or were copies, whatever. So these are the two expedients that are used to describe or to explain away these anomalies. And the problem is archaeologists tend to only know the site that they're working on, and they're not aware of the vast problem that these anomalies are everywhere. They think it's just in their site. Okay. Yeah, they've read up a little bit about the reports, of other archaeologists. But again, these other archaeologists have dismissed these anomalous finds as in the same way. So they have become attuned to just, dismissing them, as I say, almost as reflex action. And the true significance of these things is never really considered.
Right. Pardon me for a brief moment. We have a super chat from Constellation Pegasus. Is it true we have text that continues without interruption, proving Noah's flood is nonsense? Is it true we have text that continues without an interruption, proving Noah's flood is nonsense?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that.
Right.
There is no text to prove that Noah's flood is wrong. There was a flood, and that's fairly obvious from paleontological evidence from throughout the planet Earth. Was there a man called Noah? Almost certainly not. Noah's flood is the biblical retelling of a universal story, which is found among the peoples of the Americas, the peoples of Australia, the peoples of Asia, Africa, you name it. Was there a flood? I would say yes. Was there a man called Noah? Absolutely not. Did he take the animals into the ark two by two? Definitely not. But was there a flood? That's another question.
Right. For a second, then I'm going to go back. We're talking about R.A. McAllister. So he excavated. I have to think sometimes. Was it Gezer? The
I
excavation.
think it was Gezer, yes, in Palestine, yeah.
There was something
Palestine.
anomalous about that, where I think McAllister accounted for about 25 to 28 destructive layers within the strata. And Gunnar Heinsohn was like, no, wait a minute. How are you interpreting the strata? He considered it to be far less, and I forget the exact amount. But that is also important when we're looking at strata. The Bible specifically speaks of several cataclysmic events, not including the deluge, but smaller events like the story of Joshua, or anytime there are the Battle of Jericho, destructive events. We should be able to see the destruction in the strata, and that's something that really doesn't happen a lot and consistently, to where we can say, hey, you know what? During the time of the Exodus, and we'll say 1500 or so, whatever they're counting for it, BCE, or the Hyksos invasion, we should be able to see something in the strata that would reflect that. And oftentimes we just don't.
Yeah.
I'm going to, just to piggyback off McAllister for a minute, then we're going to go to the slides. We are going to bring up the slides. But continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, you've hit the problem. You've hit the nail on the head in a sense. Velikov, as I say, the conventional idea is that the Exodus, if it happened, in fact, nowadays it's generally dismissed, but if it happened in the time of the late 18th dynasty, or maybe the early 19th, maybe the reign of Ramesses II. But of course, there's absolutely nothing in the records or in the strata of the time of Ramesses II that would indicate anything like an exodus. There's no mention of it. And this was one of the problems that Velikovsky, first of all, realized there was something wrong. How is it that every event and every character of biblical history has to now be consigned to the realms of myth and declared non-historical right from the beginning? Abraham, Joseph of the long sleeve coat, the Exodus, even David, even King Solomon now are considered mythological. And Velikovsky came to realize that the problem here is that Egypt's history has been tied wrongly. It has been fitted wrongly together with biblical history. Bring Egypt's chronology forward a few centuries, and things begin to fit into place. Two of the most spectacular examples. There was a great female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, reigned during the early 18th dynasty. Okay? You bring her forward 500 years, she becomes a contemporary of King Solomon. Now, lo and behold, Hatshepsut, the most important event of her life, was an expedition to a mysterious land called Punt, where they grew frankincense bushes. And Queen Hatshepsut made this was a central event in her life. It's recorded alongside her divine birth in her great temple at Deir el-Bahari, just outside Thebes. So where was Punt? So according to conventional scholarship nowadays, it's Africa, because there were loads of African, it's either Eritrea or Somalia. But there was African animals portrayed, like I think there was a giraffe and leopards and things like that. And also frankincense grows wild in Somalia and Eritrea. But of course, in the tropical Jordan Valley, which is the lowest point on the Earth's surface, in ancient times, frankincense was a major product of that region. And of course, into the Old Kingdom period in Egypt, all the animals typical of the African savanna wandered all over what is now the Sahara Desert and the Arabian Desert. And as the climate dried, of course, most of these disappeared. But in some places where there was ready water supply, these African-style animals survived. And we know there were giraffes on the borders of Syria and Arabia into Roman times. And we know there were, even to this day, gazelles and leopards still roam around those regions. So basically what Velikovsky said was Punt was Israel, or certainly the Jordan Valley, Jordan Dead Sea Valley, where the frankincense trees grew. And it was a major source of the wealth of Israel at that time. Professor Louis Greenberg, had the brilliant insight that what Hatshepsut was doing, in fact, being a woman sitting on the throne of a pharaoh, which was completely illegal, she had a problem. How did she solve that problem? She identified herself with the goddess Hathor Isis. Hathor and Isis were identical. Now, a woman could be thrown off the throne, a goddess couldn't. So throughout her life, Hatshepsut deliberately identifies herself as an incarnation of Isis, Hathor. Okay, so what did Isis do in her myth? Long ago, before the time of Hatshepsut, Egypt was ruled by this goddess Isis, after her husband Osiris had been murdered by Set. Wait for it. Osiris's body was floated down the Nile, and it came ashore at Byblos in Phoenicia. And there it grew into the trunk. The body of Osiris grew into the trunk of a tree, a tamarisk tree. And Isis journeyed to Phoenicia to retrieve from this tree the body of her husband. So what was the purpose of the great expedition to Punt? To bring back living incense trees to Thebes, okay? And that was, Hatshepsut makes that very clear. She was recreating the journey of Isis to Phoenicia, okay? To that part of Asia, which was called Punt, the divine land, or the land of the god Osiris, okay? So was Hatshepsut the queen of Sheba? Yes, Velikovsky said. After Hatshepsut dies, the throne is occupied by Thutmose III, the greatest conqueror of Egyptian history. What does he do? In his first year, he invades Palestine and he plunders the great temple in Kadesh. Where was Kadesh? There were several Kadeshes. It means the holy place in the Phoenician Hebrew language. But there were several cities called Kadesh in that region, one of which was Jerusalem. We now know that Jerusalem at that time, in the early 18th dynasty, was a mighty stronghold. And yet, according to conventional historians, Thutmose III bypassed Jerusalem without even mentioning it in his texts. Okay, he mentions tiny settlements in Palestine that he conquered in his first year, but he doesn't mention Jerusalem. And yet he plundered the treasures of this great temple in Kadesh. Okay, so what is Israel? What is Jerusalem? Should I say called throughout the Old Testament? The holy mountain, the Kadesh mountain. Okay, so Velikovsky says Thutmose III, also called Gege, Zhezhika, was the Shishak, Pharaoh Shishak, who plundered the Temple of Solomon after Solomon's death. He come up out of Egypt, and he took away the treasures of the house of God, it says. So Hatshepsut was the Queen of Sheba. Following her death and following Solomon's death, Israel or Jerusalem is plundered by Pharaoh Shishak. Shishak being Thutmose III. Okay, he it was stole the Ark of the Covenant. You know, famous kind of Indiana Jones episode. Thutmose III, and in fact, the plunder taken from the temple is prominently displayed in his great temple at Karnak to this day. These were astounding insights that Velikovsky presented to the world, and some of the most spectacular of his findings, but now almost completely unknown to the general public. Such was the suppression of Velikovsky's work by the academic establishment. They kind of closed ranks and refused, with several notable exceptions, I have to say. Among them being Albert Einstein, Claude Schaeffer, one of the greatest archaeologists of the 20th century, and ultimately W.F. Albright, again, one of the greatest archaeologists of the 20th century. But unfortunately, Albright only came round to seeing the value of Velikovsky's work on his deathbed, such being the problem. And one of the causes of one of the reasons why Velikovsky's work was never fully taken on board and examined. Gunnar Heinsohn, however, being a man of a far greater capacity to look at problems and to examine questions in an open mind, began examining Velikovsky's work and took it much further and in a sense completed the whole process, finished in a way what Velikovsky had started.
Right. I'm going to add the slides, and let's kind of just go through a few things. These are the slides that Gunnar provided for the show on History Valley last year. This is not the final edit. So we're talking about the Exodus, and these are some of the dates that have been used over the years for proposal of Menes, or the beginning of the Egyptian dynasties. Now, we know that it at one point went back to 6400 BC.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of revisions. Breasted says 3400 at the bottom left, which is close to what I would say consensus is today. I would say. I even see Palmer. I would imagine that would be Trevor Palmer, far right side.
Yeah.
It's 2024. But we see that the dating has fluctuated over the years. And that was something that he absolutely talked about. I'm going to move forward, though, real quick here. I'm going to just scan through these slides. This slide here specifically, and it does say an 800-year hiatus found by Manfred Biatak, who also has been on the show twice, in Tel Daba between B, which is 1080 BCE, and A, which is the 3rd century BCE. Although B's, and I can't pronounce that word, culture continues in A. It was later hidden by dividing B and A into 6 substrata layers, B31 plus A31. Since they must cover 1,250 years from 1310 to 60 BCE, they have an average duration of more than 200 years, whilst 10 strata before them cover some 50 years each. So if we look at the chart at the bottom, we have 3rd century BCE Hellenistic strata. Then when we get to B, we're going back to 1080 to 1310. And then we go to actually D1, which is post 1540 BCE. And these strata levels through H are subdivided into very short periods, though the strata is said to be 1 meter per each strata layer, which is 3 feet. So the question looming for Manfred Biatak is, why did he subdivide B and A into to be able to cover mainly 1,250 years? That's a question. We've talked about that question. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that, of how the Hellenistic era
Yeah,
is right on top of the Ramses? They flow into each other. We
yeah.
know that. Go ahead.
But basically, what you're saying is that some epochs have a huge amount of archaeology, and others, like for 1,000 years, have virtually nothing. So they have to kind of subdivide things into subdivide space into huge periods of time for which nothing actually exists, and this is the problem of the faulty the faulty chronology produces this. Okay, so in some periods like DE and all this, 1 meter is 50 years and all this kind of stuff, 100 years. But for 1,000 years here, we've got two stratum, A and B, to take in basically almost 1,000 years, which is absurd. As you say, yeah, the Hellenistic epoch is sitting right on top of the Ramesside, the 20th, 19th, 20th dynasty. Now, and that's absurd. You can't have 1,000 years unaccounted for in history. The whole of that region wasn't uninhabited for 1,000 years. Um, the logical step to take, with the logical conclusion to draw from that, would be that the Ramesside epoch came immediately before the Hellenistic period. In other words, Ramesses III would reign just before Alexander the Great. Um, and that is exactly the conclusion that Velikovsky came to in Peoples of the Sea, that Ramesses III is also known as Necht-Aneb, was in fact Nectanebo, the last great native pharaoh who repulsed a Persian attempt to reinvade Egypt by Artaxerxes II before Egypt was reconquered by Artaxerxes III, just about 20 years before Alexander um, conquered the whole region. So the archaeology fits perfectly with the reconstruction proposed by Velikovsky and Gunnar Heinsohn. Gunnar Heinsohn, of course, agreed that Ramesses III was the same person as Nectanebo. Okay, but it makes absolutely no sense at all if the conventional history is correct, the conventional chronology, because you have the Hellenistic period, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and then for 1,000 years you have nothing until you get to Egypt's 20th dynasty, uh, around 1,200 BC, which is ridiculous. There is absolutely no evidence to suppose that vast areas of the Middle East were uninhabited for almost 1,000 years before the time of the Alexander the Great. A complete and utter nonsense. And this is the problem. One after another, events, characters, empires have to be declared fictitious because the faulty chronology is making a mess. It's making a laughingstock of history as we understand it. One people after another can't be accounted for. We have found no evidence, for example, of a Mede Empire. The Medes were the great precursors of the Persians. The Medes fought against the Lydians and King Croesus. They were enemies of King Croesus and King Alyattes of the Lydians. They were the precursors of the Persian Empire. The Medes were known as the mighty Medes. They controlled the whole of the Middle East. They crushed the Assyrian Empire, and we have not found a single artifact belonging to the Mede Empire and their great kings, Cyaxares and Arbaces and all the others. Nothing, not not a piece of pottery, nothing. We haven't found anything. But 700 years before the Medes, there was a great empire, which we know all about, which is well attested in the archaeology. That's the Meta, the people of Meta, or Mitanni, the people of the god Meta, contemporaries of Egypt's 18th dynasty. They speak a Persian language, Old Persian. They worship Old Persian gods. they have names very strikingly similar to the kings of the Medes. We have a Parsatra, a bit like Phraortes, and we have a Shoshtatar or Shoshatra, which is very similar to Saixaras or Huashashtra, as it's pronounced in Old Persian. It's a rather difficult language to pronounce. But the point is that the kings of the Medes have the same names as the kings of the Mita. But the problem, of course, is that the Mita people are dated 700 years before the Medes. And again, this was Gunnar Heinsen's. This was the pivotal identification he made, which really to me is the greatest proof that he was onto something of immense importance.
Right.
But again, completely ignored, and this evidence was presented to archaeologists and prominent archaeologists like Manfred Bietak, etc., and they refused to listen. Now, Manfred Bietak, in particular, is very guilty here. He now admits, for example, that the Hyksos, who conquered Egypt, had their spiritual home, and that is his exact word, their spiritual home in northern Syria and northern Mesopotamia. That is the land of Assyria. The Hyksos had their spiritual home in Assyria. Now, 30 years ago, Gunnar Heinsen identified the Hyksos as the old Assyrians, the people conquered by the Mita Empire, the Mitanni Empire. So Shashatra, the king of Mitanni, boasts of the treasures taken from Nineveh to adorn the great palaces of Washukani, the capital of the Mita people. Okay. So the Greeks talk of the Assyrians being conquered by the Medes. We can find no evidence of this in the archaeology as it stands. But 700 years earlier, there is the Meta people do conquer the Assyrians, the old Assyrians, okay, who are contemporaries, by the way, of the Hyksos. Now, so ultimately, Manfred Bietak is now admitting, without acknowledgement, that Gunnar Heinsen was right, that the Hyksos were Assyrians. But he hasn't admitted, and he hasn't given Gunnar the recognition for his correct identification, which is a major problem.
I have a slide here. In this slide here, it briefly from left to right, the Mitanni are sourced from the 14th century BCE. And in the middle column, it would be sourced from the Bible, the 11th and 10th century BCE. But we know the Medes, then, according to the archaeological strata, are the Mitanni. They're one and the same. And they were, the Greek text has them dated to the 7th and 6th century BCE. This also would help to place David in the correct time period that he belongs in. So if you look at the middle section in green, again, the non-biblical sources of the Habiru, and those are David Roll's sources under Yeshua and Dawadah in the time of King, boy, my eyesight, of Tyros. Phoenicia attacked the city of Jabus under Abdi Sheba. And then the middle column, the Hebrews under Yeshai and David in the time of King Amalek of Tyros and Phoenicia attacked the Jebusites and controlled Jerusalem. Then in actuality, being the Medes and Mitanni are one and the same, that David is parallel with Joshua and the Hyksos, both fighting the Jebusites because they don't live 450 years apart. The next piece would be the premature Proto-Anolean capitals. And then we know Elite Mazar and Israel Finkelstein agree that these capitals are out of place by some 400 to 500 years, possibly.
Yeah.
But genuine Anolean capitals are from a later period of time. And I do think I have that here. That's another big conundrum that, Professor Heinsohn spoke about on this show.
Yeah, another anomaly. One of the many anomalies routinely brushed under the carpet. Routinely, yeah. So this is the problem. The archaeology has been, and ancient historians have been in the process of brushing anomalies under the carpet now for 150 to 200 years. You just wonder how long they can keep doing this.
Right,
big problem.
Right. I'm gonna bring a question up that somebody's asking right now. So I'm confused. Why has academia not got all of this straight? Well, the topic today is the BCE chronology based on biblical fundamentalist dates? I have a book called The Bible and World History that offers very simple to read charts. The Bible's been around for quite some time, and those dates were fixed dates. 2100 BCE approximately for Abraham. I would say, what, 1800 or so for Joseph?
Yeah.
Still, the Exodus maybe 1500 BCE, if not later. So when the archaeology happens and they're doing the digs and excavation, the archaeology is conflicting with the story and the chronology of the story to make it simple. So what I'm going to do then, we're talking about the Aeolian capitals here. I actually answered the question instead of letting the guest answer the questions. I'm just flipping through some of the slides here, see if I can hit on some bullet points. These are his slides, and I, just have them arranged with how he presented them to us. So I'm gonna back up. The Medes and Mitanni, we have the Aeolian capitals, strata in Jerusalem, catastrophe and plagues. What would we have 6 disasters mentioned through sources from 2200 BCE up even and through the 7th and 6th century BCE. So we have the Odocadians, the Hyksos, Joshua, right before the Mitanni, David's time, and right before the Medes. So Gunnar Heinzone is saying stratigraphically, they're all one and the same. So it looks like we have definitely a Bronze Age catastrophe of some sort that can be verified through the destructive layers. Would you like to make a comment on this briefly?
Yeah. I'm not in agreement with Gunnar regarding the Exodus. So he would place it in the time of I have differences with Gunnar regarding the details. But certainly the Exodus the Exodus for me is an event of early Egyptian history, either the end of the second or the end of the third dynasty, and that Joseph of the many-colored coat or the long sleeve coat is in fact Imhotep. Both characters solve this crisis of a 7-year famine by interpreting the Pharaoh's dream. And it's an age of cosmic catastrophes, clearly, that period of time. So Gunnar would place it the Exodus, he would place it much more recently. He would place it at the beginning of maybe the end of the Hyksos period, directly preceding the rise of the Medes. So I have problems with that. As I say, the evidence which I have examined from the Ipuwer papyrus and the prophecy of Nefertiti and these catastrophic events which are being referred to, they long precede, in my opinion anyway, the time of the Mitanni and the 18th dynasty. However, these are minor, as far as I'm concerned, minor details, I suppose, to be kind of hammered out. What for me, Gunnar's great insight, his greatest, and he had many insights of immense importance, but the greatest one of all was this, and he expressed it in an article in Religion magazine. It was called Blood Sacrifice and Priest Kingship, a cosmic decree. Okay. And he realized that all the early civilizations, now this was the way Velikovsky's thinking was moving, and this is probably the conclusion Velikovsky would have come to had he lived a bit longer. But Gunnar realized that the parallels observed between the civilizations of the old world and the new, the Far East, etc., pyramid building, dragon worship, human sacrifice at the tops of these pyramids or these ziggurats. All the early civilizations, their earliest phase, display blood sacrifice and cosmic serpent or dragon worship. Okay. He realized that the civilizations rose, all of them simultaneously, in the wake of a major cosmic catastrophe or series of cosmic catastrophes, okay? They arose simultaneously, and human beings throughout the world reacted to the same stimulus in identical ways. Human beings being human beings. We're all the same species. We react psychologically the same way in no matter what part of the world we find ourselves. So the Spaniards discovered the last operational pyramids in Mexico. And what the Aztecs told them um actually was very significant in terms of the early civilizations. When they asked the Aztecs, why do you perform it? Why do you sacrifice human beings? They said that were we not to do so, the sun requires human blood to survive. And were we to cease these sacrifices, the sun might not rise in the morning, the earth would be plunged into darkness, and a great cataclysm would sweep the earth and wipe out the human race. The sun requires these hecatombs of human beings, the blood of these human beings, in order to survive. Now, we have similar ideas, and Gunnar Heinz had realized that the first idea of kingship appears as priest kingship. The priest, the high priest, and the king are identical characters, and they are sacred executioners. What they do is they execute the victim. That is their role. That is how they appear first in human history. Now, right at the beginning of the Abraham story, and again, this is the proper place for Abraham. It's not in the Middle Bronze Age. Abraham belongs right at the beginning. He meets Melchizedek, the high priest extraordinary, the very personification of the priest king, okay, the immortal priest king. In Israel, in the land of Israel, or Canaan as it's called, okay? Now, Abraham initiates this custom again, both in the old world and the new world. Circumcision comes in at the same time. It comes in precisely with the founding of the first pyramids, the first priest kingship, the beginning of the worship of the great dragon. Okay, Quetzalcoatl, the Chinese, whatever dragon, whatever part of the world, the dragon is worshipped. The cosmic serpent, it flies through the sky, it breathes fire and brimstone in the earth, and it causes a cataclysm, which comes close to wiping out the human race. Okay, humanity is traumatized. What does this mean? What is this monster flying through the sky?
Mhm.
It enjoys blood. What if we offer it blood? So one man leads, and he takes on the guilt of the whole community by sacrificing the victim. Okay, this is the priest king. Okay, so priest kingship descended, as it says in the ancient Mesopotamian text, from heaven after the flood. Priest kingship descended from heaven. Okay, and the early priest kings are sacred executioners. That is their role. That is their job. And because they take on this guilt of the community, they are invested with immense power and privilege. Okay, they are the intermediaries between the community and the gods. Okay, they are the ones preventing the recurrence of cosmic cataclysm. Okay, and in this period, again pointed out by Velikovsky, as a great English explorer, Colonel Fawcett, Percy Fawcett calls it an eruptive age. This is an eruptive age recalled clearly in ancient Indian Native American legend when vast earthquakes struck the whole planet. All the ancient megaliths, these gigantic blocks of stone, built specifically with interlinking blocks of stone to be earthquake proof in areas of the world which are not anymore subject to earthquake. In Stonehenge in England, there are no earthquakes in England of any significance ever. There are minor tremors, but you can't even notice them normally. And yet in Stonehenge, the uprights, the lintels are connected to the uprights by mortise and tenon joints, specifically to make them earthquake proof. And sure enough, ancient British, Welsh, and Irish legend talks of vast earthquakes in the ancient times in these regions. Okay, an entire area of Wales sinks under the sea after a vast earthquake. Ireland's legends tell of huge eruptions of the earth in early times. Okay, so these things are found all over the world. This tradition of an age when the cosmos and the earth and the natural order was in chaos. Okay, And the only way that human beings could respond to this was by the invention of blood sacrifice, altars, meaning high place. An altar is from the Latin altus, a high place, were built to be up close to the gods, up close to the cosmic serpent, where the victim could be sacrificed and its blood and its heart offered to the sky gods. Okay, the vengeful, dangerous sky gods. Okay, so Gunnar Heinsohn brought it all together, and he realized that the civilizations of the old world and the new world began simultaneously. There's no gap of thousands of years between the two. And the pyramid is a significant shape. It's not just local conditions or local economies that caused the Egyptians to decide, placing one mastaba on top of another, as we find this textbook. This is nonsense. These shapes, the idea of a pyramid as a sacred mountain has a cosmic significance, and that's why it's found all over the world. It's not coincidence that history holds a great mystery. That is not a coincidence. And people are right. Graham Hancock is mocked and all, and a lot of things he says is, as far as I'm concerned, indefensible. But there is a mystery there. And as long as the establishment sticks their head in the sand and says there is no mystery and this is all, pseudoscience and poppycock, then, alternative theories, some of them genuinely crackpot, are going to thrive because the real evidence isn't being examined by the establishment.
Yeah. So then Gunnar Heinsohn, in his work that he presented for the BCE Chronology, talks a lot about the Greeks being closest in terms of their recording of history at the time. And it seems as though scholars over the years have tried to discredit the Greeks.
Yes.
One thing that comes to mind is the creation of Samaria. Ancient Samaria replaces the Chaldeans. Now the Chaldeans don't have a culture. But he would say that this stuff only goes back to about 1,000 or 1,200 BCE or so for the rise of the civilizations, not 3,500, 4,000 BCE, etc.
Right. Well, that's one of the problems caused by the fake chronology. It spoils the whole of history, and as I say, one after the other, characters, peoples, civilizations, empires have to be decreed fictitious because we can't find evidence of them, but we can't find the evidence because we're looking in the wrong place. So there are no Medes anymore. We say, well, conferences have been held about this. Oh, where are the Medes? This mysterious empire that we can't find any evidence of. Where were these Chaldeans? We can't find any evidence of them, etc., etc. And yet, in place of these, lost peoples and civilizations that the Greeks talked about, we discovered, lo and behold, new peoples that the ancient peoples knew nothing about. The Mitanni, the Sumerians, the Hittites instead of the Lydians. The Lydians were a mighty power who fought Persia, according to the Greek historians. King Croesus was confident enough to take on the Persian Empire, which ruled the whole of Asia. And yet, apart from the ruins of Sardis on the Aegean coast, where are the remains of this mighty Lydian empire? Well, the Lydians spoke a language which is identical to the language of the Hittites, Nishili or Luwian. The Lydians were the Hittites, the Mitanni were the Medes, and the Sumerians were the Chaldeans. We've found them okay, but we have misdated them and thereby misnamed them. And the whole of history has just become a nonsense, repeating itself. Empires and civilizations duplicated and triplicated hundreds and thousands of years before they actually existed.
Right.
A comedy of errors, as Velikovsky called it.
Because it makes it seem like in our modern times, like Jules Oppert, is that his name? Oppert, that came up with the idea of Samaria. That we know more now than the Greeks did at the time. The Greeks are constantly looked at as they didn't get things right. They were meticulous record keepers, and it would only suggest that we have a much shorter historical chronology of these monumental cultures. Gunnar Heinsohn definitely pointed that out. People will just kind of say, "Oh, well, where's this coming from?" or what have you. But it looks like we are, in our modern times, making ancient history into a mockery, essentially.
We've made a complete nonsense of it. The Chaldeans were the inventors of astronomy and science and maths and all this, according to the Greeks. And sure enough, in early Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were the inventors of writing and mathematics and building and brick and stone and all this kind of stuff. But the Sumerians are placed thousands of years before the Chaldeans, or 2,000, or 1.5 or 2,000 years. So, of course, they can't be the same, but they were the same person. And of course, the Chaldeans, their civilization is ancient, but it's no more ancient than the civilizations of China and the Americas and various other parts of the world. They all rose simultaneously, actually. And that was Gunnar's great, as far as I'm concerned, his great insight. His greatest contribution. There is no high civilization. There is no literate civilization before about 13 or 1400 BC.
Right. It comes as a shock to most that we would even look at this stuff, to where it's just saying, hey, I know for certain the Egyptians did not number their dynasties. That would be the works of Manetho. And I don't have confidence that moving forward, then placing dates on the dynasties are correct. Once I've read and seen it all, I can't unsee it now. I can't unsee the entire thing. So again, the Bible has been around and the dates have been around. And though the Egyptologists, what you're saying, don't maybe take open claim to say that their work is based on biblical fundamentalist dates, they indeed are. Whether Gunnar Heinsohn said, if you take the Abrahamic dating system term away, you still have fixed dates, 2100, 1800. There's certain fixed dates that we have. And when we excavate, we don't see the proof of the fixed dates, is really what it comes down to in a nutshell. I'm gonna add the slides back to the stream and see if we can pull some other information. The modern imagination of the Hyksos centered in the Syrian desert, Mesopotamia, is seen as a separate entity, although the Hyksos, as well as the contemporary old Hittites, would write the cuneiform and use the scimitar swords of the 3rd millennium old Akkadians, with Naram-Sin as their greatest king in Nineveh. Heinsohn made the claim that you would say that Naram-Sin, Narmer, Ninos, Nimrod, and Narmer, they're all one and the same, essentially. That story in itself. You want to talk about that for a moment or two?
Yeah, well, I would tend to question Gunnar's interpretation on this. As far as I'm saying, as far as I can see, Ninos, the mythological founder of Assyria, would be the god Ninurta, who would be the biblical equivalent of Nimrod. But I can't say that he would be the same person as Naram-Sin, who was the son of Sargon. Okay, because Sargon, I would agree with Gunnar, as the king of Assyria. He's a conqueror, but the idea that he's placed around 800 BC, obviously, if what Gunnar says is correct, and my own researches would certainly confirm that.
Right.
But that's, typically, in my interpretation, civilizations and founders are deities. Okay, they're not actually human beings. The Greeks typically descended all their kings and all that from gods. Okay, and their civilizations were founded by deities. So I would say Ninos is actually the god Ninurta, but Naram-Sin is in fact an incredibly important character. And so is Sargon in Egyptian history, because Sargon conquered Egypt. He is the Hyksos. He is the Hyksos conqueror, Saritis or Sarek. In of course Akkadian, Sargon is Sharakan, and King Sharek is the conqueror, the Hyksos conqueror of Egypt. But of course, namely the Assyrian conqueror of Egypt. But that, of course, is not accepted. However, as I say, even Manfred Bietak now admits that if we look at the northern Syria there, Aleppo, he agrees that this is the spiritual home of the Hyksos, not the Arabian desert. So northern Syria and northern Mesopotamia. Now, northern Mesopotamia is Assyria. So from Aleppo to Nineveh, that is the region that Manfred Beatak now admits is the spiritual home of the Hyksos, which is the land of Assyria. And in a sense, in short, he is admitting what Gunnar Heinsohn said 30 years ago that was correct, that the Hyksos were Assyrians. Okay, they introduced the Akkadian language, which is the language of Assyria. They introduced that throughout the Near East, so that in the Amarna letters, for example, from the time of Akhenaten, which is the end of the 18th dynasty, Akkadian is the lingua franca, is the language of international diplomacy. Who made it that? Who made Akkadian the language of international diplomacy in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt? If Syria, Palestine, and Egypt hadn't been conquered by an Akkadian-speaking people. But they were. You know, the Hyksos were an Akkadian-speaking people. They were Assyrians. Their gods, you know, they worship the god Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar. They introduced Mesopotamian technology, like the scimitar sword, the chariot. The Egyptians even used an Akkadian word for the chariot, the Markabata, okay, which is an Akkadian word for the chariot. The Hyksos brought in this Akkadian, this is a Mesopotamian invention into Egypt. Button badges, these peculiar talisman badges that are found in Egypt in the time of the Hyksos, are from Mesopotamia. A thousand cultural indicators clearly show that the Hyksos are of Mesopotamian origin, you know? And as I say, Manfred Beatak has more or less now admitted that, but without giving Gunnar Heinsohn the credit for this discovery.
And there have been arguments with some of the BCE work over the years. I've read arguments from Ev Cochran, Eduardo Cardona. So I can say that if there are some issues with the research, which is really, really broad, maybe misidentification here or there, it doesn't diminish Gunnar Heinsohn's work to where he gets an F essentially for the research. I would say with, you know, if being criticized by your peers is what we're supposed to do. It doesn't diminish the work, though. There's maybe a misconnection here between what I call doppelgangers, where you're duplicating kings or triplicating kings. If there's a misconnection or misidentifications that have been outlined, I still don't think it diminishes his work. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Nobody gets everything 100% correct. Everybody, you know, we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. I've made so many mistakes, I've kind of lost count of them. I've had to admit on many occasions that I was wrong. I've had to kind of rethink whole areas of research. So yeah, Gunnar might not have got everything right, and you know, I can accept that. And we all, you know, anybody that is an open-minded researcher can accept that and move on from there. You know, take what was good. I mean, Velikovsky made many mistakes, many serious errors, which of course his critics were quick to point out. But the point was that he was still onto something of immense importance, and many of the things he said have stood the test of time. And it will prove the same with Gunnar Heinsohn. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And I think in about 50 years' time, you know, if we still have a civilization left, the world events are going at the way they are at the moment. But if we still have a civilization left, I think the history books will be something very, very close to we'll look at the history, you know, the BC history books anyway. Will look very much like what Gunnar Heinsohn has been proposing over the past 35 years. I'm quite convinced about that.
Right. Right now, I think that we are going to end the stream. We talked a little bit over an hour. I want to thank you again for coming on. We talk about these subjects a lot. Again, with the passing of Gunnar Heinz, and I thought it only fitting for you to come on and talk about these issues and kind of give the people a brief synopsis of what he did with the BCE chronology. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning into the show today. God bless and good night. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.